My name is Jessie DiTilio. I'm Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art here at the JSMA, and I curated the exhibition Emancipating the Past, Kara Walker's Tales of Slavery and Power upstairs. So I hope you guys have all gotten a chance to see it. If not, this is the closing weekend. So you have through Sunday, and hopefully today's program will get you thinking about issues that the exhibit raises and get you excited about looking at that material in a new way if you haven't, if you want to go back or if you haven't seen it yet. So this is the second to last in the long series of programming we've done for this exhibition, which has been really exciting, and it's been so encouraging to see how eager people are to engage with these issues of race and identity and think about and discuss what the show raises. So the last event is tomorrow at 2 p.m., and it's going to be a conversation with Jordan Schnitzer about art collecting, and he's going to talk about Kara Walker and why he collects her work. So that'll be exciting if you're available tomorrow. I'm going to start by thanking our sponsors. We first presented this program in February, and it was then organized in conjunction with the Oregon Humanities Conversation Project. So thanks so much to them for introducing us to Walidah. This event today is sponsored by the Division of Student Affairs, the Office of the Vice President for Equity and Inclusion, the Black Student Union, and has additional support from the Eugene Public Library. Our program today, Why Aren't There More Black People in Oregon? A Hidden History, will be facilitated by our special guest, Walidah Imarisha. Imarisha has taught courses on topics as diverse as the history of the Black Panther Party, race and the history of prisons, Hurricane Katrina, and hip-hop as literature at Portland State University, Oregon State University, and Southern New Hampshire University. She has facilitated writing workshops for students in 3rd to 12th grades in community centers, youth detention facilities, and women's prisons. Imarisha also filmed and co-directed Finding Common Ground in New Orleans, a documentary about Hurricane Katrina's aftermath. Please join me in welcoming Walidah.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Whenever I have a lapel mic, I feel like a talk show host, so I want to be coming out and like, hey, you get a car. But I'm not going to. I don't have a car to give you. But this is amazing to see so many folks coming out. I know I was, we had a lot of folks who couldn't get into the public library event, and so when they rescheduled this one, I was wondering, will there be people are enough people going to be interested? So thank you for being interested. And thank you to Jessie and Sharon and Jill and everyone who made this event possible and brought me out. So I'm excited to be here and to talk about the topic today, why aren't there more Black folks in Oregon, a hidden history? And so just a little bit about me. You heard some of my bio. I'm not from Oregon. I grew up overseas on military bases. And so even though I grew up in places like Iceland and Germany, because I was on military bases and the military disproportionately recruits people of color, those bases were predominantly folks of color. And so we moved to Springfield, Oregon, actually, when I was in high school. And this was certainly the first question I asked as I looked around. Wait, y'all, why aren't there more Black people in Oregon? And then I wondered if I should be worried. And so we'll talk about both of those things today. So that's just a little bit about me. So this is going to be an interactive program. The goal is to actually spark conversations and dialogues around these issues, rather than me just lecturing at y'all for an hour and 15 minutes and then being like, questions? Anyone? And then continuing on. So what I would love for folks to do is actually to just right now introduce yourself to someone you don't know and just say your name and what you came here hoping to get. So just take 2 minutes to introduce yourself and make a new friend. So if everyone can wrap up and come back to the larger group. This is not going to be the last time you can talk to your new friend, so if you made a connection, you will get to continue that momentarily. So I just wanted to give a layout of the agenda for the program. So I've developed a timeline that looks at Oregon Black history, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a few minutes. And we're going to start by touring the timeline in pairs. So this is where your new friend comes in. Ha, see? So you can choose to go with your new friend. If you brought a friend and you feel like my new friend is very nice, but I want to stick with my old friend, that's fine as well. But you're going to tour it in pairs. And the goal is, again, really to have dialogue and conversation. So you may not get to memorize every single slide, but hopefully it's sparking conversations you don't normally have. We're going to come back together in the large group and have some dialogue and conversation and discussion about the timeline. And then we're going to break into small groups and talk about what is the connection between this timeline and the current reality of Oregon today. So that's the agenda. So if you're one of those folks who needs to know what's coming, now you do. So a little bit about the timeline, just some disclaimers. So the timeline is not comprehensive. It's about 35 key moments in Oregon history that I think begin to answer this question, why aren't there more black people in Oregon? But also speaks to the history of race, identity, and power in Oregon. I believe that this is absolutely Oregon Black history, and this is absolutely Oregon history. This history has shaped every single one of us in this room because we all live in Oregon, even if it's just momentarily. And so it's important to recognize this is actually all of our history. So this focuses on Black history because that's my area of scholarship and expertise. I think it's incredibly important to look at the ways other communities of color have been impacted. I think that many of the same ideologies, policies, and practices that have shaped the Black community here in Oregon have also shaped other communities of color, but they've manifested in different ways. I've included a few slides so you can compare and contrast what's happening in different communities of color, but I absolutely encourage folks to learn that history as well and engage in that scholarship. Making sure I hit all of my disclaimers. So again, the goal is not to memorize every single slide. I know we're attached to the University of Oregon, but there will not be a quiz. You don't have to get the shakes or worry about it. The goal is really to have dialogue and conversation. So if you don't get through every single slide or you don't get to read every word on every slide, that's fine, that's okay. I actually have the timeline available as a YouTube video, and part of it is available for download as a PDF. And I can give you that information when we come back. So as you're touring it, just know if there's important information, you don't have to write it down right that moment. You will have access to it. So you can just kind of be in the moment with your new or old friend. So another one of the important disclaimers is that some of the images and information is shocking to folks, especially if they have not encountered it before. Obviously, it is not there for shock value. It is there because it is the lived history and the living legacy of people in our communities. And my definition of community is if that one of us is carrying a load, we're all carrying that load until we find a way to change that in the future. So just recognizing that's the framework around that and why we need to have these conversations. So there are a few ways to engage with the timeline. So as you can see, it's actually hung up around the room. So if you are feeling energetic and you want to get up with your partner and walk through, feel free to do that. I would just ask everyone not start at the chronological beginning over here because you're not going to get through. But it's also interesting to tour the timeline backwards or jump into the middle and kind of break this idea of history as a linear progression upwards and recognize, well, we'll talk more about that. I don't need to tell you all of that right now. Just don't all start at the beginning. How about that? So if you do not want to get up and you feel like I am fine in the seat, I am enjoying this seat, and I want to keep my seat, that's fine as well. I'll be actually projecting the timeline overhead. So it is on a PowerPoint timer to be able to get through all of the slides in the time period allotted. PowerPoint is, we fight all the time, y'all. So at this point, PowerPoint, I feel like is like Skynet and has gone sentient and it's just doing its own thing. So I can't slow it down, is basically what I'm telling you. So you don't have control over that. The last way to engage with it is I actually have the timeline available in binders. I have 4 of these. So you can look through it and turn the pages like PowerPoint, but you have all of the control. So I only have 4 of these books, so I just ask that folks give primacy to people with mobility or vision issues so that the people who really need those books can have them. But after that, you're welcome to come get them. I just also ask that you form smaller groups around it, so maybe 2 pairs around each book for folks so that more people get access to the book. So those are the different ways of touring the timeline. You can physically walk through it and tour it, you can sit and watch it on the PowerPoint, or you can engage with it in the binder. So we're going to take about 15 minutes for this part of the exercise. Are there any questions folks have about the timeline touring piece? All right, find your new or old friend. So we've got about 5 minutes left. So we've got another couple minutes. We're almost done with the PowerPoint is almost finished. Great, so if everyone could head back to your seats, we'll come back to the larger group. So if everyone can head back to their seats, we're going to come back to the larger group. Thanks, Zach. Great. So I just want to start this. I start every presentation off with this question. So how many folks here went to public school, K through 12, sometime in Oregon?
Jefferson High School.
Okay. All right, Jefferson. Great. We don't have to say them all. But and how many people learn this in their high school, during their public education in any sort of organized fashion? Oh, one? Okay. So that is, by and large, the response that I see. I've given this presentation to thousands of folks all across the state. If you can name a small town in Oregon, I've probably been there talking about Oregon Black history. And by and large, you know, there's a handful of folks who learn this in any sort of organized way in their education. And a lot of times it was, you know, the teacher shutting the door and being like, I'm going to tell you what's really happening around here, right? That's part of why I call this a hidden history, because this is not something that we see in the curriculums in public education. And I actually did a presentation for the Portland Public Schools PPS recently, 90% teachers and administrators, and probably 90 to 95% of them didn't know a lot of the key moments in Oregon Black history. And folks were very upset about that. Many people had moved here to Oregon and they felt like, where am I supposed to get this information if it's not being provided to me? How am I supposed to be educating students when I don't even have the information I need? So I just want to get some reactions for folks. What were folks' reactions to the timeline? We forgot to say this earlier, but if folks could come to the microphones, because we're actually recording this so people can actually hear it. So you have to be a little bit braver to talk. But just any reactions folks had or things that stood out to you about the timeline, specific slides that stood out? Thank you. Brave soul.
The late date of getting rid of the law in the Constitution, there were dates in the 80s and 90s that just shocked me.
Absolutely. I think that that's an incredibly important point, right? It's not just when these laws were originally passed, but some of the repeal dates are very important, absolutely. Any other reactions or slides or information that stood out to folks? Y'all are scared of the microphones. I know.
I need a mic. I can't remember which slide, but the railroad, the importance of the railroad, and 98% of, I can't remember if it was black men or black people.
Absolutely.
And between 1880 and 1890, the population doubled, which I don't remember what the raw numbers were, but still, regardless, the railroad was significant for a lot of different cultures.
Absolutely.
Yeah, interesting.
Absolutely. That's an incredibly important point, that the first large influx of black folks came with the completion of the transcontinental railroads, which is not necessarily, part of the narrative of the railroad, but it is incredibly important to recognize, as you said, the railroad was a significant piece in American history for all communities, communities of color, white communities as well.
I guess something that isn't in your slides, but was a key moment in this town, was when the county commissioners voted to demolish the black town across the river at the Ferry Street Bridge. I think it was in the early 50s.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that.
And then black people in this town moved out to the swamps in West Eugene.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. One more? Thank you.
I was aware that the KKK was a big part of Oregon history, but I didn't realize that they had that much influence on politics.
Absolutely. I think that's an incredibly important point. The large numbers of Klan members here as well as nationally, and their political influence is that other piece. Absolutely.
One of the things that stood out to me were the restaurants, and one of the restaurants that kind of showed the characters of certain Black characters that were shown in, in the back.
Yes.
Yeah,
thank you.
That are shown in through like blackface. There's still one in Lincoln City.
Right.
That one really surprised me.
Yeah, so the Coon Chicken Inn was a series of 3 restaurants that were all over Portland. This one was in the Hollywood district. You entered through the smiling caricature face of a Black person. There is a restaurant still operating today in Lincoln City that was called Little Black Sambo's and now is called Little Sambo's. And I actually was there just maybe 6 or 7 months ago and took pictures, and it's still there. Get your pancakes at Little Sambo's. Yes, we'll take one more comment.
2 comments. I think that a lot of people don't realize, and the timeline helped me to realize, that Oregon was founded as a white supremacist state. And Oregon has a reputation in some parts of the country as being quite liberal.
Right.
And the second comment is kind of depressing, because the timeline is extremely educational, and it also shows what a long way we still have to go.
Yeah, thank you for both of those comments, and that's actually a perfect segue to talking about some of the pieces. I want to just give a little bit of historical context to understanding, why Oregon is the way that it is. And so I think it's important to kind of go back to the beginning and recognize that in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s in this country, the number one issue was slavery. Right? It is eventually what tore this country apart, and it is eventually what caused the bloodiest war with the most American casualties in the history of this nation. And so I think that we often have a very simplistic narrative around slavery, that there were people who were pro-slavery and they were bad, and there were people who were anti-slavery and they were good, right? So the pro-slavery bad, I'm not necessarily going to spend a lot of time contesting that, but I want to talk about the anti-slavery piece, because the reality was actually much more complicated than that, and Oregon is a key example of this. So I've met many Oregonians who are very proud that Oregon came into the Union as a free state, right? And while it is true that slavery was abolished by the time by the time it became a state, the reality is much more complicated, because there were many, I'm going out on a limb and saying that 100% of Black people were anti-slavery for issues of justice, morality, freedom, self-determination. There were a large number of other communities of color and white folks who were also anti-slavery for those same reasons, right? White abolitionists who, in some cases sacrificed their life to end this unjust, immoral system. There was a larger section of the white community that were pro-slavery. And I think that that's an incredibly important thing to remember, because I think we look back now and we say, well, of course slavery had to be abolished. It was inevitable that it would be abolished. But during that time period, it was not a given that slavery would be abolished. There were many people who were saying that actually if we just tinkered with it a little bit, if we just reformed slavery, we could make a kinder, gentler slavery, right? So I think it's important when we talk about, institutions today, and, there are conversations happening around, abolition or reform, to recognize we've actually had these conversations in this country before. And at that time, it was not a given that slavery would be abolished. So there was a large segment of the white population that were pro-slavery. Then there was a segment of the white population that was anti-slavery, but also anti-Black. And the reason for that is because for them, slavery was an issue of economics, right? That there were 2 economic systems in the United States at that time. In the North, you had industrialized labor, right? Free labor, which was often exploited working class immigrant labor. And in the South, an economy based on chattel slave labor. And so one nation with 2 economic systems can't continue. The question became which one would would win. And so it's very interesting to look back and see the folks who owned these factories and corporations, many of them whose names we know today and are on a lot of things, including some foundations, that talking about being anti-slavery for economic reasons. And you can actually go back and read editorials in newspapers written by those folks or the folks who work for them, aimed at white working class populations that say, the reason that you can't get a job, the reason your wages are so low isn't us, it's these slaves. We can't compete with a slave economy. They're taking your jobs. Does that sound like familiar rhetoric to folks? Maybe heard, right? Again, I think it's important that, I talked about this idea, we're told history is linear. I actually think history is a spiral, right? It's not a circle, we're not in the exact same place, but we can look up and see it if we know to look up. We've had these conversations before, right? So it's really important to recognize that, folks who had an economic interest in industrialization and white working class folks who were being told that the slave, system was the reason that they were being exploited, were anti-slavery and anti-black. This is the birth of Oregon, is within this context of being anti-slavery and anti-black. And I think this commentary around Oregon being rooted in white supremacy is incredibly important. Oregon's very foundation was created as a white homeland, a white nation state, right? This was a place where white folks could come and get away from the issues of the day, which were seen to be tied to the presence of people of color. So come here and get away from that and build the kind of white homeland, the white utopia that you dream of. This is why in 1844, when Oregon was still a provisional government, still a territory, they did outlaw slavery, right? Before the United States as a whole. And they included an exclusionary clause that said black people were not allowed to live in Oregon. They also included the Lash Law that said black people would be publicly whipped every 6 months until they left the state of Oregon. So again, the idea of Oregon is rooted in this foundation of being anti-black as well as anti-slavery. Anti-slavery primarily because they didn't want folks bringing black people into this space. And I think it's incredibly important to recognize that Oregon is actually the only state that was admitted to the Union with a racial exclusionary clause in its constitution. Number one. So the Constitution banned any black folks not living in the state at this time, and again, this is 15 years after black folks were told they would be publicly whipped if they moved here. So at that time, in 1860, there were about 124 black folks in Oregon. So it banned any black folks not residing in the state of Oregon from living, holding real estate, or making any contracts within the state. That meant that black folks had absolutely no legal standing, and their very presence in Oregon was a criminal act. They had to do nothing other than be here to be committing a crime, to be a criminal. Their very identity was criminalized. And a scholar, Egbert Oliver, wrote and called black folks, he used the term illegal aliens, I prefer undocumented folks, that black folks were, the first undocumented people in Oregon. I think, again, this is a very important conversation for us to have because we are having the same conversation around immigrant justice, around who deserves access to services, around who is considered a citizen, around who is even considered a human being, whose identities are criminalized and whose are respected. So this is part of that history of Oregon. I think the other piece that was brought up that is incredibly important is this language was not removed from the Oregon Constitution until 2001. Right? So until 2001, this was part of the Oregon Constitution. And to be clear, it's not that people forgot that it was in there, right? It was not like, oh my God, it was at the bottom of my to-do list and I forgot. Crap, let me take care of that, right? This is something that folks were fighting to have removed over and over and over again for over 100 years in this state. And it wasn't until 2001 that, leaders in the black community along with allies were able to, push this change through. And if anyone was in the state, they remember this, there was a lot of backlash and pushback about this, about not wanting to take this language out of the Constitution. And the pushback was around saying, well, we want to preserve Oregon's history. Right. which many folks heard as wanting to preserve this idea and this ideal of a white utopia and a white homeland. Right? So I think when we begin to ask the question, why aren't there more black folks in Oregon, this is an incredibly important beginning piece, that Oregon was very clear from the beginning that not only did it not want black people and other folks of color here, their identities were criminalized. And again, this same mentality has shaped other communities of color, right? The black population was excluded because those were the needs of the dominant culture at that time. But the same ideology of creating a white homeland is something we see echoing throughout this timeline for other communities of color as well. Thoughts or reflections or other pieces that stood out to folks? If anyone wants to come up to the microphone. If you could come up to the microphone.
Another first is Oregon had the highest per capita membership in the Ku Klux Klan.
Yes, absolutely.
You say, it wasn't just that they forgot, and even if they did, even if it was on the bottom, like the lack of prioritizing that just speaks volumes also.
Sure.
So, that just, gosh, can't believe it.
Yeah, so there's this, there have definitely been points in the history where, there have been policies by the larger government of benign neglect is actually a term that was created by Senator Moynihan in the 60s and 70s and signed off on by Richard Nixon, the president at that time. The idea of benign neglect at that point was to allow communities of color to basically slowly suffocate without services from the larger state. So, and this is actually what happened in the South Bronx, which is where hip hop was born. So in the 1970s, no trash was picked up in the South Bronx. Fire departments, the fire departments wouldn't respond to fires at all, or they responded hours later. Schools were shut down in the Bronx. There was no public transportation available in the Bronx. The police didn't come when you wanted them to come, right? They did come, but not to respond to issues in the Bronx. This was a policy of so-called benign neglect, right? Just leave them on their own and see what happens. And I think that obviously that policy is anything but benign, right? But in Oregon, it was certainly never benign, right? This cancer was malignant and very, very active.
I know this is probably a big question here. I kept asking myself the question, why? What was it what was the cultural disposition? What was the impetus behind all of this regulation that sees one race or people group as superior to the other?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. I think it goes, a lot of times folks say, well, why Oregon, right? Why was Oregon so different from the rest of the country? I think that Oregon is useful to study specifically because it is not different from the rest of the country. The policies, ideologies, and practices that shaped Oregon shaped this entire nation. The difference with Oregon is they were bold enough to write it down. A lot, right? That's the main difference. This country itself was created as a white homeland, right? A white utopia. The colonizers who came here from Europe said that God gave them the land to make it productive, that indigenous people were not using it properly, and that they had the right to do whatever was necessary to make this land productive. That was called manifest destiny. And I'm not making that up. I mean, if I added in a few more thous and spelled things differently, that would be pretty much exactly what they said at that time, right? So, Oregon reflects this ideology that created the entire nation we live in. And we see these, again, ideologies happening in different states in different ways. So, it may look really different in Alabama, where they did not exclude black folks because they needed enslaved black labor to be able to pick, cotton and tobacco and other crops. So they had different mechanisms available for control, right? For control of black communities. But the ideology was the same. And that's why I think Oregon is a useful case study, because we can look at Oregon and see, again, written down in black and white, things that may not have been written down in such a clear way in other places, but were clearly being enacted as well. And just one more way that, the Oregon is a useful case study is that, so the Civil War ended in 1865, right, with the 13th Amendment. And it was 3 years before the 14th Amendment, which granted universal citizenship rights, was passed. So for 3 years, every black person in this nation was in the same political situation that black people in Oregon had been in. They had no political standing, they were undocumented, and their very existence, was if not invisible to criminal, right? And so we see that many of the policies and practices that Oregon instituted before this to control and contain black populations become practice and policy for the larger state. So legal segregation, Jim Crow segregation, right, that we see the civil rights movement working to tear down, is something that we see in practice in Oregon very clearly, right? That, in 1862, Oregon adopted a law requiring black folks as well as Asian folks to pay an annual tax if they could, for being here, just because you're here and we don't want you here and you have to pay us. And if you can't pay, we can actually take you and use you as state labor for 50 cents a day, but that 50 cents goes to paying off your annual tax, right? So basically, folks were, enslaved through the prison system, which is something we hear about now, right? With the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander's book, looking at slavery and the prisons as something that grew together. Oregon also banned interracial marriage before, and their ban lasted longer than in other places. And Oregon was incredibly segregated. Oregon was called the most segregated city north of the Mason-Dixon line. Or Portland was called the most segregated city north of the Mason-Dixon line. So the schools were segregated, public life was segregated, institutions were segregated. We see that these ways of controlling and containing communities of color in general, and black folks specifically, become the law of the land once this nation no longer has slavery to control and contain black communities. There has to be some other mechanism. And again, Oregon becomes a front runner in that. Sorry, I know, I got going.
I think especially thinking about the Oregon Constitution made me think about the way that the University of Oregon itself, in a lot of ways, mirrors the racist legacy of Oregon, and I would say this was also, I think, founded as like a white supremacist institution in a lot of ways, and I think that's exemplified through the exclusion laws and through the Oregon Constitution, because there's one building that is really memorialized or held up on this campus. It's D.D. Hall, which is named after the person who wrote the exclusion laws into the Oregon Constitution, and this is a building that is put on, it's the on the plaques that holds our diplomas, and is held up in this way that really, I think, memorializes and really points out the legacies of white supremacy on this campus. And I'm not sure if we've really made as much progress on this campus as a lot of people think we have.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's a really important connection to make between what's happening here and this larger history, this living legacy. So thank you.
I just find myself wondering, do we have any sources from these historical black people in Oregon as to how they experienced this? I think to myself, well, one could get on the railroad and go to Oakland or Seattle, but some people chose to stay, and I just find myself wondering, do we have any sources on that might have expressed, I don't know, feelings of some type of opportunity that they saw here in spite of all of this, or some motivation for staying or even sending for one's cousin? Do we have any sources that let us know of any sort of how black people saw all of this in, let's say, the early 20th century or late 19th?
Yeah, that's a great question. Absolutely. So there's the Northwest Black Pioneers organization. And so they've actually been doing a lot of work to capture those voices and stories and to look through these historical documents. There's actually a great book that they put out called Perseverance, which focuses on Marion and Polk County, right? So really kind of breaking out of the, this corridor and looking at, what are those experiences in different places. There's actually a new book coming out. I'm trying to remember what the name is. It's A Light in the Darkness, in the Wilderness, in the Somethingness. And it's about Letitia Carson, who was a black woman in the mid to late 1800s who dealt with a lot of these issues and made a stand around that. So I think the book is supposed to be out in a couple months. And then there was recently a book that came out called Slavery on the Oregon Trail that is very powerful by a former Oregonian journalist that looks at, that actually there were some cases of slavery in Oregon and what did that, we talk about Lewis and Clark, right? And we talk about York, who was the black man who came with them. He was technically Clark's slave, right? He was enslaved. So from the very beginning, there has actually been slavery on the Oregon Trail. So I think that oftentimes when we tell that story around York, it gets really prettied up, and the reality is that he was enslaved. He was essential to keeping them alive, keeping Lewis and Clark alive at that time. He actually served as the main negotiator with indigenous communities who were like, we don't know about those white folks, but we'll talk to you, right? He was seen with respect and honored. And when they got back to the East Coast after that trip ended, Clark called him insolent and sulky and beat him and threatened to sell him. Right? That was his thank you for keeping him alive. And so eventually York was able to run away and escape. But I think it's important that even the tiny pieces of Oregon Black history we have been sanitized to such a point that they are almost in many ways unrecognizable from the reality. Yeah. Were those some?
I also found myself wondering, California had a lot of similar things, although maybe not in the Constitution. But you still have these sources of, the great estate for the Negro, a sense of hope, a sense of leaving the South and just any new place to start over, anywhere. Are there any sources that express that type of sentiment, or was it always seen as so different, even from a place like California that had some similar features?
Right. We can talk about that in just a minute, actually, because it moves us into the next section.
I didn't see anything in the timeline about an apology from the state of Oregon for its treatment or an affirmative action program to encourage black people to come to Oregon, let alone black reparations for the damage that was done. Is there any counter trend among progressives or African American associations or anything else in Oregon to not only understand the history, but to try to reverse it or change it?
That's a great question. So when the exclusionary law was finally repealed from the Constitution, there was an apology issued by the state government, and it was I'm forgetting what the official title was. It wasn't our bad, we're sorry, but that's basically what it amounted to. But in terms of I think this question about acknowledging that history is important, but how do we work to change, transform, and set right what has been wrong for so long is a really important question. And that is not one that has been adequately addressed through political means. I actually just gave a presentation at a conference around diversity for government employees. 500 government employees from across the country came to Portland for this conference, and it was an equity conference. And I think one thing I said is that I mean the government has a responsibility in this, not just because the government is, according to our laws, it's all of us, it's we the people, but because the government has again and again and again reaffirmed that this idea of white supremacy and racial injustice was the state that they wanted to live in, that we wanted to live in. And so, racial justice can't be a one-off. And I think that too often when there are attempts made at racial justice in institutional ways, they're one-off. Well, we said sorry. We gave you a day of apology. I'm not sure what else you want, right? And I think it's important to recognize that this racial injustice has been institutionalized, and so racial justice has to be institutionalized. It has to be affirmed again and again and again, because we've had centuries of affirmation of racial injustice. Do you want to speak, brother?
Yes. Thank you very much. Brother was speaking to a question of the cultural disposition of the time when this was happening, right? And so that's your grandmothers, that's your grandfathers. I would suggest we go and ask them why. And then I ask us why. Because we have the same nonsense going on in the prison industrial complex right now. So I ask the culture in this room, what is our disposition? Why this is still happening? Okay then, right? All right, so let's move along. So we have some cultural interdependence that needs to happen. It means that my culture lean upon your culture because we one culture, right? All right then. So we're talking about the same story. We're talking about our history. So we own it for ourselves. This isn't, oh, what is this black history? No, this is my history, right? So I want to hear about more of kind of the struggle, more of kind of what the people were doing to make it right along the way, because that's the story. That's the lineage. That's the fire that we want to carry into the future. Absolutely. Not sad stories that are true stories, but let's take the happy stories in his role.
Absolutely. I think that that's a really important point. And actually, a third of these slides are people creating the kind of community they want to live in, working to make change, winning policy changes. So I think that a lot of times, especially when the information is new to folks, it's so overwhelming that we focus on the negative. But to recognize that there's always been organizing and recreating moving forward. And that I think, the only reason a black community exists in Oregon at all is the determination, resilience, and determination of black folks and support from their allies, right? That there was never supposed to be black communities in Oregon at all. And the fact that black communities are here, that they have created institutions, and that they have set down roots is important to recognize that is a form of not just survival, but transformation as well. But
to add to the depth of how the racism was ingrained and institutionalized, if you look at some of the covenants when you buy houses, right. I bought a house in Springfield back in the 80s. And in the covenant, it says, no Negro or person of Asian descent could own or live in this house. Now, it was a rat hole. I was buying it to rehab it. But yet, still in the covenant, it said that I couldn't live there. And you find that that covenant was in most of the houses, especially in this area and in Portland. So it restricted to where we could move, where we could live. And that's why the blacks were living over right where Fair Street Bridge is now. Then they evicted them, sent them out to West 11, the swamp. I heard somebody else call it the swamp earlier. And that's because they weren't allowed to live in the city of Eugene. Eugene was a sundown town.
Yes.
And people don't realize that because we're speckled around, and you have to understand why there is no black community in Eugene, and we're peppered all over town. It's because we finally were able to buy wherever our money could buy, but that wasn't always the case. Yes. And that didn't change until the 70s. And half this room was on this planet in the 70s. So it's not like we can say that was a long time ago. I'm still alive, and I remember when it was real, and it was ugly. And the police department used to keep a book of black men. Now, at first I didn't believe it. So I went and asked the police chief, and I asked the mayor, and they said, yes, indeed, the book existed. Anytime the police would see a black man, they would take his picture. Then they started doing it with the Hispanic community. Now, the book doesn't exist anymore, they say. I would always ask, where are the negatives? No one's told me where the negatives were. They just said the book was destroyed.
Right.
But those are the kind of things that definitely, and that was in the 70s and 80s. So and now we done brought in another generation of people in this room that was born during that time. And you can be accountable for that too. Right. Because those were the parents of some of you in the room.
That's good. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that history and that framework. That's incredibly important. And the piece around sundown towns is very important, right? That, and I just want to elaborate a little bit. That folks talk about sundown laws. They're actually, folks haven't been able to find the laws that were passed and written, other than the Black exclusion law, which is pretty big, but these towns were known as sundown towns, which meant, if you were not white, don't let the sun set on you, especially if you were Black. You can come in if you need to do business during the day, but you better be out before the sun goes down. And there's actually a scholar, James Lowen, who has been collecting information about sundown towns, past and present, because there are still dozens of sundown towns, if not hundreds, across this country. And so there's actually a great website that you can look up. If you just Google sundown towns, it takes you to a website with an interactive map where you can click on states and then on cities and see which cities were sundown towns and read the accounts of that. And Eugene is absolutely on that list. Eugene was a sundown town, right? Salem was a sundown town. Basically, the entire Rogue Valley was a sundown town. And when we talk about comparing to Washington and showing that Oregon is not that different, Tacoma, Olympia, and Seattle were all sundown towns, right? So again, the concrete practices and policies may have looked different, the wording might have been different, but that ideology is very much the same in play. So I think that piece is incredibly important to recognize and to remember. I think the other piece around housing is incredibly important, that those covenants are across the state, that people are owning property to this day that says they're not allowed to own that property, and that was something that was institutionalized by folks like the Portland Real Estate Board of Code of Ethics. They wrote down that real estate agents were not allowed to sell to individuals whose race would be determined to lower the property value of the neighborhood. And a little bit later, they said, well, maybe we weren't clear enough. We meant Black and Asian folks, let's be clear, right? So we're not leaving that up to choice. So I think it's incredibly important to realize that these are also pieces that were reinforced by a variety of different forces in society, right? I want to talk a little bit actually about the Klan, because I think the Klan is a useful example to talk about. I think that, again, the Klan, the way that we tell the narrative around the Klan is very simplistic, right? It was a small fringe organization in the 50s and 60s. It was made up of, the stereotype of mostly, undereducated, working class, ignorant Southern white men, right? That was the Klan. It's by and large died out. The reality is much different, right? The reality is that the Klan was a massive organization that spanned this entire country and that had enough political clout to influence at every level of government, including the highest level in the White House. So at the height of the Klan, 15% of eligible Americans, which meant white men, were card-carrying members of the Ku Klux Klan nationally, right? So 15%. Amnesty International doesn't have 15%, right? The Humane Society, y'all, everybody loves puppies and kitties. They don't have 15% of society, right? And Oregon had the highest per capita Klan membership in the country. So again, even though the numbers of people of color, immigrant folks, Catholic folks, the folks who were targeted by the Klan were much smaller, right, compared to the larger population, this was about, again, sending a message. My carrying this card shows you what kind of Oregon I want to live in. Right? I think that the other piece about that is that, when I say that, people were like, well, there are a lot of stupid people. That doesn't mean anything. It's important to recognize that, again, policymakers, folks in the highest level of government were members of the Klan. So this picture ran on the cover of the Oregonian. And in this picture is the Portland police chief, the district attorney, the U.S. attorney, the Multnomah County sheriff, and the Portland mayor. And they are standing with hooded Klans members on the front page of the Oregonian. The title says, Chief Kluxers Tell Law Enforcement Officers Just What Mystic Organization Proposes to Do in City of Portland. Right? So not only are they proud enough to stand with hooded Klans members on the cover of the Oregonian, they are taking guidance and leadership. They're like, well, what's your strategic plan, Klan? Let's talk about that. And we had a Klan governor, Walter Pierce. Walter Pierce was elected in 1922, a card-carrying member of the Ku Klux Klan. And he worked to support the Klan in pushing through different legislation, one of them being the Compulsory Education Act, which influenced public education. This is the time when these institutions that shape every single one of our lives are being really solidified and made concrete. And this is some of the mentality and ideology behind that. So when we talk about institutionalized racism, we have to recognize it is 100 years old, hundreds of years old, and that we have to get to that root of it, because these institutions were created at a time when the idea was about creating a white homeland, and that folks of color, black folks, immigrant folks, Jewish folks, Catholic folks were completely unwanted. Right? The other piece about this is that at the same time, the president was Woodrow Wilson. Right? Woodrow Wilson wrote a pro-Klan history book that became the basis for Thomas Dixon's The Klansman, which was the basis for the film Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is perhaps the most virulent, racist, pro-Klan propaganda that has ever been created. And Woodrow Wilson would screen Birth of a Nation in the White House for visiting dignitaries. It was the first film that was ever screened in the White House. And he would show it and say, this is why we need organizations like the Klan. So you folks, you're getting whatever images you're getting in your countries, and you're reading the NAACP's newspaper, The Defender, and other pieces. This is the reality. This is why we need the Klan, right? So I think, again, the Klan was not a fringe organization. They were something that was actually at the heart of American culture and at the heart of the creation of many American institutions. I want to talk a little bit about that, the resistance piece and the Black community a little bit more. And this focuses on Portland. My apologies, Eugene. But I just want to highlight a few pieces because, not that Eugene is not incredibly important, but the vast majority of Black folks have always lived in Portland, in Oregon, with one exception we'll talk about. So again, the first large influx of Black folks came with the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And by 1941, 98% of Black men worked on the railroad. And I think that, again, it did double the population. It was up to 1,186, right? So when we're talking about doubling, but we got a comma, so we were moving on up. So the question became, in a city like Portland, which again was called the most segregated city north of the Mason-Dixon line, where would all of these folks get their needs met, right? They couldn't go to doctors, they couldn't go to the barber shop, they couldn't go to these other, public and private institutions because they were segregated. So a Black community in Portland grew up around the train station. Partially because that's where Black folks by and large were working, and partially because no one else wanted to live near the train station at that time. And so the heart of it was the Golden West Hotel. And if anyone takes a trip up to Portland, I encourage you to actually go see it. The building is still there, and they have an exhibit on the second floor, so you can actually learn more about this first Black community. Because the majority of folks, even in Portland, don't know that the first Black community was actually in the heart of downtown. And it was in the heart of downtown until that land was deemed desirable, and then folks were relocated. And because of things like the Portland Real Estate Board's Code of Ethics, the only place folks could move to was the Albina neighborhood, a very small neighborhood in Portland. And that was the situation until the 1940s with World War II. So World War II, it was part of the Second Great Migration, right? Because of the wartime efforts, folks were being recruited from the South to come work in these northern industries. And the recruitment was disproportionately targeted to Black folks. And the idea was something someone talked about, this idea of come to the North. It is, at this time, there were lynchings happening predominantly in the South, but again, across this nation, about every 3 days in this country when you average it out. And again, the majority of them were in the South. Lynchings were a state-sanctioned campaign of terrorism against Black communities to keep them in their place, right? And so the messaging to Black folks in the South was, come to the North, the land of freedom, the land where we don't have segregation, where you can, engage in getting a job that pays a living wage, you can get out of sharecropping, which is keeping you destitute, and you can begin to grasp the American dream. And so Black folks left in the hundreds of thousands to come work in these industries. And in Oregon, it was Kaiser shipyards. So because the Black population was restricted to Albina, which was about 2,500 Black folks in full, Kaiser had a problem. Where am I going to house my workers? He's like, I can solve this. I'm rich. He got a grant to get land in between Vancouver and Portland, Vanport, unincorporated land, and threw up a city and made himself the second largest city in Oregon. So at its height, Vanport housed 100,000 people, and 40% of them were Black. The first time I saw that, I was like, there's a typo in this. Somebody needed to spell check. They added a 0, it's 4%. I was like, oh no, 40, wow. And I think, again, Vanport is maybe a piece of Oregon history that folks know about, but it's never talked about in the context of saying, no, this is actually Oregon Black history, 40% Black. And it was an incredibly important piece. One of the interesting things about Vanport is it was segregated. It was supposed to be segregated. But as the war efforts heated up and more folks were coming into Vanport, they couldn't keep the segregation lines. They had to just slot people in wherever there was housing available. So actually Vanport became desegregated, right next to Portland, not by choice, but because of economic necessity. Sorry. So Vanport washed away completely. Vanport no longer exists. The Columbia River flooded. There was one of the dams protecting Vanport broke. There was actually an entire side that wasn't dammed where water also flooded in. Because it was made with surplus materials, it was not made, they were not well made, and the houses literally floated away from the foundations. There was absolutely nothing left of Vanport at the end. And so there were, at this point, this is after World War II ends, there's still 17,000 people living in Vanport, even more disproportionately Black. And the influx of those folks into Portland proper changed the lines of racial dynamics in Portland for the future. And this was the second large influx. And for Portland, it was, in many ways, kind of the first time that city government felt that there were enough Black folks that some concessions needed to be made, right? That suddenly the population had gotten large enough that it needed to be dealt with in a different manner. So Vanport is incredibly important to the Black community. So there are just a couple pieces that I want to talk about. So after Vanport flooded, the lines around Albina were expanded. 4 out of 5 Black folks lived in the Albina neighborhood in Portland until folks approved the construction of the Memorial Coliseum. So if you go up to Portland and you go to the Rose Garden, you go to the Memorial Coliseum, see the Blazers play, that was the heart of the Black community. It was literally dropped on top. And then the highways came in. So where 84 meets 5 meets 99, that was the heart of the Black community. North William Street was the main artery of that community. And, I think in terms of that piece that you brought up, brother, about resistance and, creation, so, this area was incredibly highly segregated, and folks in Portland ended up making that neighborhood an underground jazz treasure, right? How many people knew Portland was a jazz treasure, y'all? Okay. Because when I heard that, I was like, I'm sorry, what now? So this, everyone played in Portland, right? North William Street, apparently, I wasn't there because, 1956, but I'm not that old, y'all. I'm not that old. But, apparently you could hear jazz 24 hours a day. All of the greats played there and loved playing there and told everyone, Portland Black community is the spot. You got to go there. So I think in terms of this idea of recognizing that even within this intense, immense segregation, folks are creating this culture of resistance and this culture of rebirth that is something that everyone ends up wanting, right? That I've heard, some older white folks talk about, sneaking down to North Williams to hear like Duke Ellington play because they weren't supposed to be in that neighborhood, right? So that was North Williams Street, and it was literally cut in half by the Memorial Coliseum and the highways, and it was left to die. So there were thousands of homes that were demolished for this. The other piece that I want to just highlight is in 1970. So Emmanuel Hospital expanded. Emmanuel Hospital is in North Portland as well. And so they got federal funding to expand, which is great, right? Bigger hospital, more services. That's awesome. They worked with the city to use eminent domain to take the thousands of housing units around Emmanuel Hospital. People were given 90 days notice to get out. And homeowners were given a maximum of $15,000 for the house, which was about $1,000 less than median market value. Renters were given $4,000. And again, 90 days told to relocate. And again, this is at this point in 1970, this is the neighborhood that has been home to folks' generations, right? I think one of the most important pieces about this story is that the construction ran out. The money for construction ran out. So the money ran out after demolition, but before construction. So if anyone went to North Portland from 1970 up until today, that neighborhood was a wasteland, right? It stayed in that condition for decades. And it's just now with this resurgence of gentrification that the neighborhood has shifted. Emmanuel Hospital is currently doing construction right now as we speak. That was part of that 1970 plan. So when we talk about this being a living legacy, that this is not some history in the past, this is, I think, a key example of that. That's incredibly important. And to recognize that we can't actually understand things like the 1980s where people were saying, don't go to North Portland. It's, the wild, wild west. It's lawless. It's the jungle, is what some Portland police officers called North Portland because that's where the majority of Black folks lived. I remember when I moved to Portland in the early 90s, that was the first people said. They were like, whatever you do, do not go to North Portland. And I was like, right, which bus takes me to North Portland? And I got off, I was like, oh, now I get why I wasn't supposed to come here, because of this, y'all. So, I think it's really important that image of the Black community has to be put into context. It has to be put into context of these immense blows dealt to the community by, the highway construction, by the Memorial Coliseum, by Emmanuel, and that in the 1980s we had an economic crisis that happened. Property values were assessed at half or less of their original values. Landlords who didn't live in the neighborhood, slumlords, abandoned their properties because it wasn't worth it to them to pay the property taxes. The houses weren't worth what they were paying in property taxes, so they just abandoned those neighborhoods. And in conjunction with that, we had rampant unemployment sweeping this country because factories were moving overseas to do production, right? So in communities across this nation, specifically working class communities of color, there was 60 to 80% unemployment in those communities. And some of those statistics hold true today. So on reservations in Oregon, right now at this moment, there's 60 to 80% unemployment happening today. Right? So we can't understand, the creation of an underground drug economy as an economic survival tool or a self-medication without understanding this historical context it happened in. Did you have your hand up? Could you come to the microphone?
Rather just speak from here, if that's okay.
If you could speak really loudly then.
Okay, so I know that neighborhood, and I know quite a number of people who originally moved in there, and it is gentrified. But so many of the people who moved in there as in support of environmental justice. And they were wealthier, and it was easier to buy a house, and it did change and I'm not saying, I don't know if it was ultimately the right choice, but there were very many people of good conscience who moved into that neighborhood for social justice reasons. So what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that point is really important for folks who couldn't hear, talking about this idea. I think you're probably specifically talking about white folks moving into that neighborhood.
No, it wasn't just white, Jewish, just professionals, people who had enough money to buy a house and it was of concern to them.
Okay.
And
Right. So I think the statistics, I mean, many of the folks who moved in were white folks when gentrification and urban renewal started. And so I think this question is really important, the question of folks are moving in because they want to buy a house, they have principles and values, and they're not able to find housing elsewhere. And so folks are like, well, what am I supposed to do? And that's why I think this history is incredibly important, that we have to...
Wait, no, what I'm saying is people chose to move into that neighborhood because there were social justice issues, because they said they wanted to live in a neighborhood with other people whose children weren't treated well. They wanted to raise their children in neighborhoods in solidarity, people of faith. And so I think it's short-sighted not to recognize that. And I'm not saying you aren't, I'm just asking, do you recognize that? And
Sure, and I just want to say that that's part of why I think this history is incredibly important, that folks can't understand what's happening in the moment without seeing these larger forces and seeing us within those contexts of larger forces. And so I think it's often very easy to see ourselves as isolated and individuals, and the choices we're making impacting us, our families, and a small group of folks around us. But when we actually can take a step back and look at this entire history, we see that those decisions we make are actually within a historical context, and that there have been precedents for much of what the decisions that we're making, right? Again, it's a spiral that we can look up and say, okay, let's think about the decisions that were made before, and what are some alternate ways we could, employ our values and beliefs in a way that we've already learned maybe this way isn't the best. What are some other ways to do that? And I just want to say that, I mean, the results, so, people in that community, demanded that the city allocate resources to that community, right? That the community was under-resourced, that many of the communities across this country were suffering from that idea of benign neglect, and that it was the job and the responsibility of the city to support its communities. So the city began a process of urban renewal revitalization, which is something that, again, happened across this country. And I think that it's important to note that the result of that is 10 years later, by 1999, Black folks owned 36% fewer homes, and white folks had 43% more homes than the decade before. So I think the question often becomes, who is this neighborhood being revitalized for? And who is this neighborhood being reimagined for? Yeah. Oh, sure.
Well, I don't have a question. I've got a loud voice.
Is it overflow?
I can't hear you.
Well, I just want to say that that's my community. I'm from that neighborhood, and one of the reasons that Black folks were not allowed to, in a sense, build that neighborhood within the communities because there was a lot of injustice and bias from the banks.
Sure.
Black folks were not given loans. They were not given any type of resources to build the community that they called their community, but just because of economic reasons and also for race reasons. I've done extensive research on gentrification, being from Portland, that it has affected me. It has affected many people around me. So I think that's one of the reasons that gentrification did happen. And people that were from outside of the community came in and lived there and, in a sense, revitalized the neighborhood. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's an incredibly important point, right? We saw redlining before where there were laws about who could move where, right? And then we see those laws being taken out, as you were talking about, in the 70s here and in the 80s, you know, and we see that those laws then become practices. And so when we look at, you know, who is getting loans for housing, we see, you know, black folks are disproportionately disadvantaged in that area, as you were talking about. Or they're getting, you know, loans that are incredibly, you know, disadvantageous, right? That they get the sliding loans, the flexible rates, and are not able to get the best rates because they're deemed a risk, right? There's actually, we're gonna talk just a little bit more about it in just a minute or two. The State of Black Oregon report that the Urban League of Portland has put out has a whole section around housing and looking at that disparity and discrimination in loans. So I would encourage everyone, you can actually download the State of Black Oregon for free as a PDF. And they're actually working on 2014 now. So the last one that they have as a booklet is 2009. They've done updated sheets since then that you can also download, but there'll soon be a 2014 that looks at those disparities. But I just want to talk, just, you know, again, to kind of leave you hopefully with some hope, so you're not like, wow, well, that was a great afternoon. Thanks, Walidah. I'm really sad now. You know, that again, a third of these slides are folks building the kind of community that people want to live in. And I think, you know, it's important to highlight those and to hold on to those stories. And so for me, this slide is incredibly important. In 1867, when William Brown's children and other black children in Salem were refused access to public education because they were black, because the schools were segregated and there were no schools for them, the black community raised $427.50. That number is incredibly important, right? I mean, $427.50 in 1867 money, I don't do math, y'all, but that's a lot of money, right, for that time. And again, this is at a time when black folks had no legal standing, right? The 14th Amendment hadn't been passed yet. So, you know, we were still criminalized as that. So I think it's incredibly important to recognize that the community was able to pull together and build this institution to address their own needs. At the same time, Brown actually sued Salem for discrimination, and Salem agreed to take over the cost of running the school so that, you know, he would drop the suit. So I think it's important I think this is a great example of folks kind of building community institutions while also changing policy and practices and saying, we're gonna make sure our children get schooling because we don't know how long this is gonna be in the courts, but we are going to work to change this law because we feel it is unjust. There's just a couple other pieces I wanna highlight, and one of them, I love I should be pointing over here. I always point at the screen, and I'm like, that's not helping. 1923 is the creation of Maxville, and this was a community of black folks living in the woods, y'all. Black labor workers, lumber workers came and moved their families and created a community in Maxville. And, you know, I feel like it's amazing that folks make community wherever they're at. But I also think this other piece, Gwen Trice, who's actually the daughter of one of the original folks who came, has been doing work to get that area, you know, deemed a historic site so that people can come and learn more about that history in that community. There's actually a documentary she made in connection with OPB called The Logger's Daughter, which I think you can watch all of it online for free if folks are interested. So I think, again, folks are creating community, and then there's this ongoing living legacy of people working to preserve that so that we don't just hear about this negative, but we can also hear about, you know, the positive ways folks were able to, you know, to build and create together. And then, you know, again, jazz treasure. Need I say more? And the last slide that I want to show folks is from the the Portland Black Panther chapter. And so, and actually, Oregon had 2 Black Panther Party chapters. One was in Eugene, y'all, so most people don't know that. So I teach a class on the history of the Black Panther Party, so I'm working very hard not to go off on that and be like, in 1966 in Oakland. But so the Portland chapter of the Black Panther Party had many of the same programs that the party had across the nation. All of the parties had a free breakfast program for children. So every party in this country, over 40 chapters, fed children every morning. And actually, the California treasurer said in 1969 that the Black Panther Party was feeding more children than the United States government at that time. And in fact, the reason that we have free and reduced lunch programs, those started very shortly after the Black Panther program and were seen as a reaction to the parties feeding all of these children. The other piece that the Portland chapter had is another thing that many chapters had, which was a healthcare clinic. And they actually had two clinics. They had a dental clinic and a healthcare clinic. And these clinics were absolutely free. Anyone could walk in off the street, anyone, and get seen and helped, right? It didn't matter, what race you were. They weren't checking for, for ID or for insurance. It was, what do you need and what can we provide for you? And they actually had one of the longest running clinics for the Panthers in the history of this country. And the dental clinic was actually taken over by OHSU, by the Oregon Sciences Health University, and is still run as a low-income dental clinic in Portland. So for me, I think that this piece is incredibly important because it says that these institutions that are created to serve those folks who have been marginalized are actually making the community better for all of us, and that when folks who have been marginalized are moved to the center, we actually all benefit from that, right? So yes, you need a microphone. I'm not sure where it is.
Could you say anything about the FBI and what they did?
So you're trying to pull me off track. I'm trying to stay focused. The question was about the FBI and the Black Panther Party. I will give myself 20 seconds. So yes, the state had an immense backlash against the Panthers. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, was actually called the Panthers the greatest threat to internal security in America, and specifically highlighted the free breakfast program as one of the biggest threats of the party, right? So it wasn't the image of the party running around with guns. It wasn't, the rhetoric that they were utilizing against the state. It was the fact that they were feeding children and honestly making the government look bad. So J. Edgar Hoover instituted COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, which was a secret, illegal organization aimed at an array of radical organizations in the 60s and 70s, but I think they had 295 operations, and 253 of them were aimed at the Black Panther Party. So the party was their #1 target. They used everything from snitch jacketing, which means calling someone an informant who is not an informant for the government, and then everyone ostracizes that person, and it causes immense disruption within the organizations, to outright assassination, as with the case of Fred Hampton, who was a leader in Chicago, and actually the clinic in Portland was named for him after he was murdered in his bed by Chicago police with the support of the FBI. That's all I'm going to say about it. That was not 20 seconds, I know. But I would encourage folks, if you want to read more, the COINTELPRO papers by Ward Churchill and Jim Vanderwall is an amazing book. You can actually read these documents. Because I tell my students this, and they're like, okay, crazy conspiracy nut lady, whatever, that sounds like something from X-Files. Well, I guess it would be aliens involved in some way. But, the COINTELPRO papers, you can actually read the documents that take credit for killing Fred Hampton from the FBI. All right, so what I would love for folks to do is that on your seats there were 2 handouts, and one of them says State of Black Oregon. So I've just pulled out some of those statistics from the State of Black Oregon that I talked about that I think relate very well to this timeline. So what I would love for folks to do is to just take a look at these statistics and then spend 5 or 10 minutes in small groups, or if you just want to be in pairs, that's fine again, saying what connection you see between these statistics and the timeline. So folks can just take a minute to look at these statistics and say, what connections do you see between these statistics on the sheet and this history that we have gone through and talked about together? Does that make sense to folks? Great. All right, thank you. So if folks want to get into small groups, that'd be great. And again, we'll just take 5 or 10 minutes to kind of go through it. So if everyone could come back to the larger group. So I just want to ask if 1 or 2 folks just want to share one connection that y'all made in your group between the timeline and the statistics. If anyone wants to come, and please come up to the microphone to do so that folks in the other room can hear you, the overflow room. Because we had so many people, we couldn't fit in one room, y'all. Hey, overflow room. Does anyone have any connection that they want to share?
In our group, we looked at, there are 3 white women. We looked at the churches, the organizations we belong to, the city club. It's almost totally white. We looked at each other and said, no, well, there's a black church. We could try getting in touch with them. Basically, the whole city is segregated, I suspect. And for many black people, the place where I taught, Lehigh University, it was considered a hardship post for the faculty and staff. They were there because they thought they should be, but some of them could hardly wait to retire and get out of there.
Yeah. Thank you for that observation about kind of decision-making institutions right now.
Can I make a comment instead of a...
Oh, I just, if you want to come up to the microphone, that's fine.
In our conversation, came up that I was looking at the 1902 photograph of the lynching, which is not an accurate photograph because there are 2 people in that, hanging in that picture, and there was one that was hung from the bridge in Coos Bay. I was looking at the photo because I was wondering if my grandfather was in it.
Thank you for sharing that. It's really powerful. Actually, I meant to say this earlier, but I met a black woman who teaches at OSU who does a lot of work around the history of the Ku Klux Klan. And she went to, and I'm forgetting which town it is, it's one of the coastal towns, to their historical society. And the woman who runs the historical society said that she had wanted to do a display around the history of the Klan in that town. And that basically the city council told her that they would block her because the names of the Klan's members in those pictures are by and large the names of the folks who are still in positions of power. And so they were like, we're not making that connection, right? So I think that I really appreciate you saying that, and I think that that's really powerful and important. And I think, someone else talked about that as well, about, we have to recognize this is not ancient history. These are folks who are connected to us, and in some of these cases, folks who are still alive today. Right? Yeah.
My comment's completely off the point, so that's why I was waiting. Okay. I think your statistics could be improved. This is all.
Do you want to just turn it on?
I'm not a citizen of Oregon. I actually live in western Pennsylvania, and some of these statistics that you've used are actually accurate, but they don't necessarily portray the differences in ways that are as meaningful as they could be. For example, where I come from, which is in Appalachia, the white population that is poor, that is the relationship between poverty and race, is just as apparent in the white population as it is in the black population in Oregon. And I wonder if your data wouldn't be better if you related that to economic factors and also cultural factors. What has always struck me about culture and its impact on people is the Orientals and the Chinese in California. And
I don't think people use the term Oriental anymore, though. I think that's an offensive term.
I'm a student of the Middle East. I use Orientals. And I'm sorry, I'm 75 years old. But the point that people who are Chinese in California who faced almost exactly the same kind of things in California and evidently in Oregon that black people and people of color have faced around, culturally have overcome that in ways that are extremely interesting. So that if University of California, Berkeley didn't discriminate against people from Asia, the majority of students there, and I think it is true today, would be from those cultures.
I think you've got a lot going on, so I want to address just some of what you're saying. I appreciate you bringing up these ideas and points. I think that one of the pieces that's important around this is first of all, these are statistics from the Urban League of Portland's State of Black Oregon report that they spend immense time and energy compiling and finding from multiple data sources. So they've certainly checked all of these statistics many times. I think the other piece that's actually important about this is that I think we absolutely need to talk about economics and the ways that class and race intersect, right? And the ways that class, race, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, all of these identities intersect. And one of the, I think, powerful things about these statistics is that the disparities for birth realities for black women, so the fact that black babies are 50% more likely to be born with low birth weight or 50% more likely to die as infants, those disparities exist regardless of class. Right? So I think that's actually a really powerful statistic. It's not quite 50% for folks who have a higher income bracket, but there are still large disparities between black baby survivals for black women of any class and white women. And so I think that's really important, right? Because it says there's something about race that we have to talk about race. There is something about being a black woman in Oregon that is living in people's bodies in a way that is literally killing their children, regardless of whether they have, access to quality health care, whether or not they have access to organic and healthy foods, whether or not they're going to mommy yoga, right? That these disparities exist regardless of class. And so I absolutely hold we need to look at the intersections of identities, and I think it's also incredibly important to isolate race and to say there's something about being black that is killing black babies and in this society, and we need to talk about that as it is, right? And I feel like the other piece you brought up is a lot, this idea around other folks of color being able to come to this country and overcome. I think the short thing I'll say is that the myth of the model minority is a very recent creation, and it was a deliberate creation. You can see the first time that folks are shown as model minorities, right? That Chinese folks are shown as model minorities was in an article in 1965, right? And when we think about what else was happening in 1965, what was happening in black communities, right? We see that this myth was serving a larger purpose, right? A larger purpose around this idea of, denigrating black communities and creating separations. And so I think it's really important to recognize that, Asian folks were not talked about as the model minorities for the majority of the history of this country, right? That, that sign said no blacks, Chinese, or dogs allowed, right? That our situations were not the same, but they were certainly not held up as a pinnacle, and that we see that this was an actual creation by, institutional forces at a time when there was a lot of unrest happening in black communities. We actually have to close, so if you want to say something super fast, because we got to get out of here.
I wanted to point out there was a cross on the butte, and there was a great controversy about that here in town. People wanted it as a religious symbol, and other people said that cross was put up there by the Ku Klux Klan, and you can't take away the history of it. You can't just say, well, now it doesn't mean that. Right. You have to acknowledge the history. And the other thing was, I hear us say things like, we have to destroy the people who are in the Klan. We have to be really mean to them and tell them how horrible they are. And I think that's just saying it's okay to have people that are on your shit list. You just have to have the right people on the shit list. It's not okay to have blacks and Jews and Chinese people on the hit list, but we can find somebody that's bad and that we can put on the place where they're not good enough and they're not really human. And I think that that's the idea that we need to change. It's not just about racism, or it's the idea that you can have somebody that's not human enough and that we don't have to respect them.
Well, I really appreciate you bringing up the point about the cross on Skinner's Butte, because I think that's a really important connection to Eugene history. And, you know, I just want to say, I think it's important to make a distinction between Klan membership, which again is a choice. And in Oregon, it was a choice by white men to say this is the kind of state we want to live in, versus, you know, folks who are actually born into their identities and, you know, are criminalized for their very identities. But just the last piece, I handed out another handout that has a list of organizations working for racial justice in Oregon. This is a growing list, so if you have organizations that aren't on that list, come up to me, and the next time I present, I'll add it on. I think it's important, you know, I don't want to send y'all away and be like, things were bad in the past, they're bad now, y'all. Again, you know, a third of these slides are positive, you know, community building slides, and there are organizations actively happening today, hundreds of organizations carrying on that work. We don't necessarily hear about it. We don't hear about what's happening in Madras or, you know, Astoria or Pendleton, but folks are there doing that work. And it's been an incredible gift to me to be able to travel around and see that. And so I wanted to, you know, to be able to create this list to share it with y'all. So again, if anyone has additional organizations, just come up to me and let me know. I'll write it down and add it. But thank you all so much for coming and for staying and for participating. I appreciate it.